Nathan, I am so excited to have you on.
Hey, Wayne, nice to talk to you again.
Yeah, it's awesome. I've been reading current affairs for so many years. It's not only, I think, probably the best distillation of the political philosophy I subscribe to, whether you call it socialism or something else, but one of the few progressive magazines that talks about animal rights, which is to your great credit.
Right.
But I thought I'd start, given that it's in the news, in talking about this United Healthcare CEO, because I think the discussion around what's happened with this murder is a wonderful distillation of, in my view, some of the problems in the discourse in this country, where we think about things in a microcosm and don't think about the bigger picture. But I'm going to read back to you something you said on the Ezra Klein podcast a few years ago, and kind of just get your reaction.
Sure.
And Ezra Klein was asking you, about socialism and what do you mean by socialism? Because doesn't everyone care about protecting the working class, protecting the vulnerable? And you're trying to clarify to him in the context of healthcare what socialism means to you. And here's what you said to Ezra. Socialists hate the idea of profiting off of denying people care, that someone gets millions of dollars just from preventing me from getting healthcare. Other progressives don't seem to hate the idea of an industry CEO, an insurance industry CEO, profiting off of people in this way. So I thought when I was listening to this, I was thinking about kind of the discussion around this guy who assassinated a United Healthcare CEO. I wonder, hearing those words back read to you today, what, if anything, has changed about your perspective on healthcare CEOs? And maybe can you just shed some light on how you think our society should respond to something like what happened a couple days ago in New York City?
I don't think my perspective has shifted that much. I still get very angry at the idea of someone enriching themselves in a business that rewards the denial of care. I think I might clarify. I might add some things to that, some qualifications, like, for example, that I don't think the implication of that anger is that it makes sense to target individuals, like an individual CEO, right? Which I don't think it does at all. I think we want to change the way that the healthcare financing system operates. That I spoke interestingly there of anger and rage, and it seems like the shooter felt a lot of anger and rage, but you can channel that anger and rage in different ways. You can join together in a social movement with people who share your discontent and injustice to try and organize to alter the way that things work, or you can do what this person did, and you can pick the individual at the top. You can say that person is getting rich in an immoral way, and justice consists of stopping that person from enriching themselves further, which you can do by ending their life. Unfortunately, that doesn't actually alter. I don't think anyone's going to benefit from that, especially because CEOs are kind of interchangeable, right? They're going to get a new CEO very soon. You can't just continue to assassinate CEOs until the healthcare financing system changes. So I think the thing I would add is that there are different paths that you can take once you have a kind of justified anger at some kind of injustice.
Yeah. So the followers of this podcast are disproportionately animal rights people, animal lovers. And so we very much know about big, powerful systems and CEOs torturing vulnerable beings. I wonder if you could just comment a little bit about why you think so many people have reacted with glee. Why have so many people seemed happy about the United Healthcare CEO's assassination or killing? I mean, what do you want to describe it as?
It's in the comments. I mean, you can read the comments and they explain it pretty well. I mean, most of the people talk about their personal experiences with the American healthcare system. In fact, Ben Shapiro did a video where he was, talking about, it's so horrible that people on the left are pleased about this killing. And you can share the view that people shouldn't be pleased about killing, which I do. but also, even Ben Shapiro's commenters are people who's going, yeah, well, Ben, I might agree with you, but let me tell you, my experience, and then people go into the story of, themselves or a family member who got sick and the, massive hospital bill that, negotiating with the insurance company wouldn't approve necessary care. And so they have so many stories and they're not really left-wing people. This glee has often come from people who don't seem that political at all, but just have a bad personal experience with the healthcare system. So I think that's kind of at the root of it, is that we have built up a lot of discontent about the way that healthcare functions in this country, and that you saw that coming out when someone took a swipe at someone who symbolizes or represents or stands at the top of that system.
Yeah, I mean, and Luigi Mangione himself, his politics seem strange to me because on the one hand, I don't know if you know this, but he was apparently a little bit of an animal rights supporter because he followed me and retweeted
Oh, did
some
he?
of the
He
stuff.
followed you? I dreaded. I checked. I was like, oh God, I hope he doesn't follow me. And I was like, oh, phew, he doesn't follow me. And then I was like, he follows an idiosyncratic group of people. That's funny that he follows you.
He does. So he was tweeting about cultivated meat. He tweeted about the verdicts that we had in these farm counties where we were acquitted for rescuing animals. But he also talks about, J.D. Vance and Tucker Carlson. So he's got very interesting politics, but it just goes to show that the people who are deeply uncomfortable, not just with our healthcare system, and frankly, not even just with our economic system, but with our system, period, it's running the gamut nowadays. It's not just people who identify as socialists or progressives. It's people all over the map, because it does seem like something deeply wrong has happened. I wonder if you can comment on this discussion you had Ben Shapiro, actually, because he didn't just say something generally about the inappropriateness of responding the way so many people have responded on Twitter. He specifically called you, and I'm reading now.
You're gonna quote him now? Quote my new blurb.
He called you, yes, he called you a socialist leech on the ass of society.
On the ass of society.
Reveling in the murder of people who work for companies you don't like. And this is in response to something you tweeted about the torrent of hate for health insurance industry CEOs, where you wrote, live your life in such a way that people will be sad when you die. So I guess my question for you is, I mean, when you see people acting with glee, and I don't see your tweet as part of that. I think your tweet is more of a philosophical comment about what is a good life and what is a bad life. But when you see people acting with glee, I mean, you're seeing, it's weird because you're seeing not just the direct responses to the United Healthcare CEO being killed, but then you have the meta level where people are responding to the responses in this really polarized way. What do you think is the right way to respond? If you have had this sort of experience, if you do see these deep problems with healthcare systems, and then you see someone who's benefiting from that system, harmed in some way, what do you think? What would you say to someone who is tweeting, reveling over this person's murder?
I mean, I get it because, as I say, you see that person, that CEO, as someone who is benefiting from something that you see as unjust. And so punishing him seems like some measure of justice, and you celebrate because you feel like the world has become more just because someone who does something immoral gets punished for it, and usually people who do things that you consider immoral get away with it. So you celebrate in the same way that we celebrate lots of victories when the world becomes more just. So there's actually it's not just sadism. I do think there is a moral component to people's reaction. I don't share that reaction because I consider myself a pacifist, except in very limited circumstances. I think that generally violence begets violence, and that it's a bad solution to our problems, especially violence against, terroristic violence against individuals. I don't think it has a very good history. There were assassinations over the course of American history, and I don't know that any of these assassinations has ever done any good for anyone. I don't know that the assassination of William McKinley by an anarchist advanced the cause of anarchism. The most consequential assassination in history started World War I, but that's about all that an assassination has ever done. So I wouldn't revel in it, but I would try and understand where that impulse comes from. and analyze it. And as you say, the thing that I was saying there, I wasn't going, ha ha, this guy got what coming to him. I said, maybe we should reflect on the fact that the fact that so many people are delighted that this man has died. I don't want that many people to be delighted when I die. I really don't. And I would worry. I mean, maybe some people who are very polarizing figures, you could live your life in a way that was good and still a lot of people would be happy to see you gone. But generally, I think it's a moment for introspection, thinking, well, why are all these people upset? And that's what I was trying to do. And then Ben Shapiro didn't seem to understand what I was saying there and called me a leech.
Yeah. Yeah, and when you read this guy's individual story, I don't know how much you've followed Luigi. I think that's his name's.
Yeah, I'm writing an article about this, so I've started to read. I've started to look at his book choices and such.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like he was very personally affected potentially by the healthcare system because he had a serious back injury a couple of years ago, and I don't think we have kind of a clear story as to what exactly happened after that back injury, but that seemed to have set him down a path to where he is today. And that's really sad and unfortunate. It doesn't justify what he did, but if you actually want to get to root causes, I think you have to tell a bigger story about why so many people are enraged, why people would be so happy when a CEO of a large company is killed. And one of the disappointing things about the mainstream media is there's been almost no discussion of that. It's just about almost the revelry over this sordid story instead of asking, what are the underlying conditions that are causing so many Americans to be so upset about the healthcare system? Because I think healthcare is the leading cause of bankruptcy in the United States, and a shocking number of Americans are suffering immensely because the healthcare system has failed. So. Yeah,
and can we have that conversation instead of a conversation about the unique pathologies of this guy and how much of it was him lashing out just because he was a person in pain? Did he have a mental illness? How much was that combined with ideology? Can we use this as an opportunity to get at some of the deeper issues that might cause this kind of anger? Yeah. He was looking at his Goodreads profile, which I think has now been taken down. He was a reader of the infamous Unabomber manifesto. And Ted Kaczynski's kind of an interesting similar figure, someone who had some valuable or interesting insights into certain things that were wrong with society, but then responded to that through a quite useless and cruel series of acts of murder. And you want to look at that and say, okay, well, clearly that guy didn't advance his cause, but let's talk about the actual issues. Kaczynski raised interesting issues about technology. And, you're someone who thinks a lot about being strategic. I'm someone who thinks about being strategic. We look at the world, we look at its injustices and its problems, and we say to ourselves, okay, what can you do here that is actually going to make a substantive difference? And I think you can contrast that approach that takes seriously how do you change the world with people like Kaczynski and like this United Health shooter who lash out in ways that clearly aren't tied to a strategy or program.
Yeah. One of the interesting things to me is I think you're right that if you look at the history and evidence on what actually strategically is effective, there's virtually no evidence that assassinations or really any sort of violence is particularly effective at creating the sort of transformation that most human beings on this planet want. A place where you can get health care without having to go bankrupt, where you're not bullied or beaten or physically abused just because of who you are. And yet the appeal of violence, you just look around in the world today, whether the Israeli-Palestine conflict, Ukraine-Russia, or even just kind of the way so many activists behave today. I don't know what your take is on the Free Palestine movement, but I think one of the fundamental mistakes they made was just failing to maintain a nonviolent approach, even in terms of the rhetoric and tone. So if you have a comment on that, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that because, I respect your opinion.
Well, in the United States,
what do you think it is? What do you think that it draws so many people to violence, whether in rhetoric or in action?
Well, the roots of why violence is attractive to human beings are beyond me to analyze and explain. I think it's but clearly there is.
But in activism and social circles specifically, because socialism has a sordid history of violence too. I mean, if you go back hundreds of years,
you can understand some of the reasons for the appeal, right? As I've mentioned, in some ways, violence can seem like justice. right? And there is a moral case, and the reasons I say it's kind of too complicated to disentangle is that it's very hard to disentangle when people make kind of rational arguments for violence, like they make a utilitarian argument like the United States did with the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, where they say, yes, obviously this is a heinous act of violence against civilians, but we're doing this to minimize future violence in order to end the war, to make sure we don't have to invade the Japanese mainland. So you can make these rational justifications that violence actually is moral and necessary in the pursuit of a just end. But then, of course, there's an emotional component to justice, and so to violence. So like in the Israel-Palestine case, a lot of the Israeli arguments justifying violence are these kinds of rational arguments. And they say, well, look, we were attacked. We have to defend ourselves. We have to eliminate Hamas. The violence is unfortunate, but it is justified and it is necessary. And I think that there's a whole other level, though, which is the emotional component of violence, the desire for revenge. In the case of Japan, right after Pearl Harbor, the United States was overcome. Americans were overcome with a desire for revenge, a desire to just destroy Japan in order to wreak vengeance on those who had wronged us, who had killed our soldiers. You see that in Israel, too, after the heinous October 7th attacks. It can't all be explained as a rational response. Part of it clearly is the desire to strike back, to do to others what was done to you. And so, like, both of these are operating, right? This side of it that is the logical case for why this violence is necessary, and also sometimes we who make these cases are in denial about the fact that we also feel a desire for violence on a much kind of deeper, more primal level.
Yeah. Have you heard of these psychology experiments about the biological roots of Schadenfreude?
No, what is this?
They're
Tell
fascinating. So they've done these experiments. So typically human beings, we have these big frontal lobes. We even have these neurons called mirror neurons where we can kind of look at another being and mimic their experience and imagine what they're feeling. And so typically when a human being sees another human being or even an animal suffering, our response is to feel empathy, to say, oh my gosh, this creature's suffering. I feel their pain. This is what vicarious pain is. This is why, for example, people can't bear watching slaughterhouse footage because they see the animals agonizingly screaming, shuddering, cowering, and it hurts. It actually hurts us a little bit. But what they found is if you can create an us versus them mentality, and they've done these experiments in children and adults, where even if you just assign people to different teams and say, okay, you guys arbitrarily, on this side of the room, you're all the red team. On this side team, you're the blue team. We're going to give you each T-shirts, and here are your teams. And then just by virtue of setting people apart from each other, when they show someone on the other team suffering, then suddenly instead of feeling empathy and having vicarious pain, your pleasure centers actually light up. Yeah. They've actually done, I think, like fMRIs where they'll show that someone seeing the suffering of someone in another tribe, they actually feel happier. It's like getting a little sugar boost into your bloodstream. Like it makes you happy, which is terrifying. And I think it's one of the fundamental things that we have to resist in the human condition, and especially activists, because activists, we're organizing people in collective action. We're creating power. That power has to be wielded very carefully, or we can fall victim to this basic tendency in human psychology that's quite dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know about this particular experiment, but it's totally consistent with the entire history of human violence and of nationalism, right? And you can see that, there are all these videos of Israeli soldiers taking delight in the destruction of Gaza, but also when the October 7th attacks occurred, a lot of people who were Palestinian or pro-Palestinian, many of their reactions changed when they found out the level of atrocities. But initially, when they found out that Palestinians had scored a victory against Israel, it created feelings of elation, excitement at the fact that a blow had been struck, again, against quite real injustices often. So that's why this is kind of complicated, is because sometimes I've described it as like an emotional feeling, as if emotion and morality are totally, you can take them apart. And if I'm having like the emotional delight, the satisfaction that you talk about, then that means there is no moral component. But actually, I think there can be, as I mentioned initially with the CEO. There's the he's on the other team, but then there's the we dislike that team because we actually have an argument for things that the things that they're doing are wrong. And so, in the case of Israel-Palestine, again, the blow that is struck against Israel is a blow that is struck against the oppressor. And in the case of the Israeli justifications, the blows that are struck against Gaza are blows that are struck against terrorists, people who want to hurt us. We're protecting our people.
So how do you make sure the focus remains on the moral argument for justice instead of just this basic human psychology? I mean, have you read anything? Have you seen any strategies internal to movements or causes, or from the academic research that you've read? Because you have a PhD in political science, right?
So with social policy, technically.
Social policy. So I mean, whether academically or just in your observations of causes of various sorts, have you seen movements that do a good job of maintaining kind of the moral basis for that outrage without devolving into Schadenfreude?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that
what's the secret sauce?
Well, I think the civil rights movement is a very obvious example of this, which is that, and you see movement discipline, you see leadership at the top that emphasizes from all of the rhetoric emphasizes in very simple terms. There is an injustice. We don't hate the people who are doing the injustice, but we are trying to end the injustice. And so you have to have movement leaders who are constantly helping people stay focused. And of course, in this case of the civil rights movement, ultimately it breaks down, right? In the violence of the 60s, after the assassination of Martin Luther King, you have a lot of people who are affiliated with that movement, people like Stokely Carmichael, who say, well, enough of this pacifism stuff. This isn't getting us anywhere. We need to be armed and we need to defend ourselves. And you see a lot more justifications for revolutionary violence. So it takes a lot of discipline, and it's difficult to maintain because, as I say, there are arguments in favor of violence, and they often seem quite compelling, and you have to kind of resist them. And oftentimes you're resisting something that has a real emotional pull and that even has a logical pull too, as I say, because you say, well, if we just take out these people, the arguments on Gaza, if we just take out Gaza, if we just eliminate their ability to hurt us, we will achieve our security permanently. And that seems very tempting. And so people who are saying, no, we can't do violence, seem like ultimately they are making an argument in favor of failure. So in the case of the civil rights movement, the things that Martin Luther King was asking of other participants in the movement were very difficult. He was essentially saying, when you're hit, don't hit back. Don't defend yourself. Accept the blows upon your body. That's really hard. You're telling people that they should be willing to be physically crushed. That's a tough sell.
Yeah. And it's a sell that I don't think is being made very well on the left today.
Yeah.
I don't know if you see anyone exhibiting this sort of leadership that you saw in the civil rights movement on the left today, but I'm not seeing too much of it. I mean, I feel like
I always think Bernie's my model of how to do left politics effectively, right? Because Bernie doesn't countenance BS, right? He doesn't have any time for violence or for things that are counterproductive. He's very good at. He's my model of like how to stay focused on the core issues, the injustices, and building the kind of political organization that can change them through the existing political system. He doesn't harbor fantasies of the violent overthrow of the government. He's very pragmatic. I like that approach. I think that's a model of how we ought to do it.
Yeah, let's talk about this approach. And maybe we can start by saying, Bernie and you both identify as socialists. Yeah. How do you understand socialism? Just define that for the audience.
Well, I pinpoint class as kind of the main thing that distinguishes socialists from people who are not socialists, right? Because one of the reasons socialism is hard to define is that many people who have used that label have had intense disagreements with one another over what is meant by it. So some people believe that markets, for example, are compatible with socialism. Some people believe that, socialism is about the elimination of the wholesale elimination of the private sector. I always pinpoint class, the idea that there are some people who are owners and there are some people who are workers, and the people who are workers have to sell their labor to the people who own the capital. And that if you want to identify something that is common in socialists across time, it is an outrage at a class system, an outrage at inequality, where there is a small aristocracy or plutocracy, where there is concentration of wealth, and where there is a much larger group of people who are deprived. And how you resolve that's the argument that is had intra-socialism. That's the argument that socialists have among themselves. What do you do about that thing? But if you want a starting position for where socialists begin to think about the world, it is looking at class inequality, where there's a small group of people who are much wealthier than the rest of the people, and it is a discontent to that state of affairs.
Yeah, so something you said there, a particular word I think is important, and that's the word outrage, because I've heard you say this before, that too often people think socialism is about some ideology or set of policies, when it's really almost about an emotional sentiment. So can you say more about that? What do you mean by that when you say, that it's about outrage? It's not just about, here's the ideal state of the world, but it's about an emotional sentiment I have about the current state of the world that needs to change.
And that's a controversial stance among socialists, because classically, historically, Marxist socialism, right, was in denial about the fact that it was predicated on a sense of outrage, right? Marxist socialism presented itself to the world as essentially entirely non-emotional, entirely scientific, that they were analyzing the class system, that they were saying that capitalism had these internal contradictions that were going to lead to a slow exacerbation of the conflict between the proletarians and the bourgeoisie, that eventually that conflict would come to a head and the proletarians would rise up and throw off their chains. But there was no real normative component to this, whereas I have always felt that socialism does have a real normative component of it. It's looking, because I think about, what formed my politics? And what formed my politics was seeing people who were poor in a land of great riches and just being uncomfortable with it, just really not liking it. And the intensity of my discomfort with it, I thought was what made me more of a radical, more than like a policy, more than like, okay, well, I believe more than you do that we need to move things out of the private sector and into the public sector. It was like, well, what distinguishes me from the people who are not radicals? And I think it's that level of being so upset that you're like, no, this is intolerable. And just to come back to what the audience might be most familiar with, and is the same is true of animal rights and animal welfare activists, right? What makes them radical? The radicals are the ones who look at it and don't just go in a very abstract way, like, oh yes, this is probably wrong. But like, no, this affects me so much that I have to do something about this, because this is really, really deeply troubling.
Yeah, I want to ask you more about how you got there, because I actually don't know much about your personal biography, but your professional biography would suggest you don't live that difficult of a life. I mean, you went to Harvard, got a PhD at Harvard. You very much had like a pretty nice life yourself. So I'm very curious about the source of your outrage. But one thing I want to comment on in that regard is that a lot of times we see as animal rights activists difference between incrementalists and people who want to demand more transformative, immediate change. And these strategic disagreements disguise a more underlying difference in just emotional sentiment. That a lot of the people who demand incremental change just are not as mad about the current state of the world. And a lot of the people who demand transformative change and say, like, we just need to stop the violence now, like we should shut down every slaughterhouse and factory farm in the nation, as opposed to cage-free eggs, slightly more space, reduced meat consumption. The people are asking for the big changes. And so, for example, I mean, that's a lot of the people who I've worked with over the last 10 years in various organizations tend to be people who just are mad. You could see it. They're the people who can't go to sleep at night because they're having nightmares about video footage they've seen. They're the people who cry about the things they see on Instagram and are just deeply affected by this stuff. And it reminds me of something that Roger Hallam, the founder of Extinction Rebellion, Roger Hallam, have you heard of him?
I don't know the founder. I mean, I know Extinction Rebellion.
You would love him. He's a great guy. I've only interacted with him kind of a little bit through electronic stuff, but he's the founder of Extinction Rebellion, the group that did mass civil disobedience in London, shut down basically the entire country back in 2019 for climate change. One of the things he says, and he's actually a PhD in political science too, so he's a social scientist. And he started this group that was basically focused on using mass arrests as a tactic to get people to start thinking about climate change. And one of the things he says over and over again is, our strategy is arousal. And I've always found it kind of funny because it sounds kind of sexual and a little weird. But I think he actually uses
arousal
that term
is
for
a
a reason.
word with many connotations.
Exactly. But I think I even heard him say that I use that term provocatively for a reason.
Sure.
I know it's going to attract your attention because the point is this is very, very distinct from the sort of, policy work you see that lobbyists are doing and traditional NGOs do. We are trying to arouse the public in outrage about the emergency that is climate change. So, and he's actually sitting in a jail cell right now, but also successfully done some really important work. I mean, the UK government did declare a climate emergency, and my understanding is the UK has changed dramatically as a result of what Extinction Rebellion did in 2018. Feel free to comment on that, but I'm curious as to how you personally got to that place where you were, sorry to use Roger Hallam's word, how you were aroused to be opposed to kind of the class inequities we see in society today.
Well, yeah. So it's true, as you say, that it's very hard to be an incrementalist if you're a certain level of angry, because another day, right? Every day that the system of factory farming, for instance, persists, like once you start contemplating, once you have within you like some sense of the level of suffering and horror that we're talking about, like once it does become like similar to the way people react to something like the Holocaust, where you feel like, no, this is not something where I can write policy papers on, because because even in doing that, I am sort of treating this as something different than what it actually is. And so all you can feel is this kind of howl of anger. But at the same time, you understand, or you have to come to understand, if you're going to move forward at all, that you need to be able to think strategically and pragmatically, and that we have to find ways to just get people, individual people, to reduce their consumption and to get new regulations on how animals are treated. All right, like we've got to do these things because there's no alternative. There's no realistic path to overnight change. Like we can't come up with one. So this is all we have, and so it's very difficult to do those things. And I think you're someone who holds those things together very nicely, actually, in that you have the radicalism, you have the outrage, but you have the willingness to do things that are against or allegedly against the law, right? Which you have to have if you really believe these injustices are worth taking seriously. But that we don't want to do things stupidly. We want to do things that we know are going to draw attention, or we know that have a chance of succeeding. So that's my comment on that. The personal stuff, it's hard to know. I mean, that's a task for a psychoanalyst, not for me. Like, what are the roots of your emotional discontent at injustice around you?
Well, have you always been this way? I mean, obviously you weren't this way when you were 2. At some point, these ideas came into your head, and you started thinking, "There's something wrong with society, and I'm mad about it."
Yeah.
Like, what's your first?
I was a fairly happy child, so I don't know. I don't
you grew up
know.
In the UK, is that right?
You should get my mom on, and she could probably tell you. You could go, when did Nathan stop being a happy child and start being upset?
Well, when did you start identifying as a socialist? Was it in college?
Well, socialist, I used to use the word anarchist in college because I liked my first exposure was to anarchist thinkers, right? So my politicization was around the Iraq War, right? I graduated high school in 2007, and so when I was like a freshman or a sophomore, I was like out protesting Bush when he came to our town because I had been given a Chomsky book by a friend, and I kind of understood that the Iraq War was wrong and that I didn't like the people who had carried it out. And so
where was this? Where'd you grow up?
Sarasota, Florida.
Okay.
So I was born in England, but then I was brought to Sarasota.
You were born in England. Okay, good.
Yeah. I was born in England, brought to Sarasota when I was young, when I was 5 years old, and then grew up in Florida, then went to college at Brandeis in Massachusetts. And so it began with a kind of anti-war politics. and that kind of, and then I went to college and I started to read like actual left-wing, the history of left-wing thought. So I took a class called on Marxism and Anarchism, and I always liked the anarchists because they were always calling the Marxists authoritarians, and I felt very anti-authoritarian, anti-bureaucratic, and so I sided with the anarchists in that conflict. And then, I don't actually know the point at which I would have started to apply the word.
But this is all very intellectual. I mean, you were talking about how you need to be aroused. There has to be outrage.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't believe that you read like a philosophy book about Marx and anarchism and decided I'm mad.
No,
was it the Iraq War, and was there something specific about the Iraq War?
I mean, the understanding that it was causing a lot of the death. But I don't know. I remember the feeling of being deeply upset by it, but why? And I remember not understanding why other people weren't. Right. Yeah. So we could only get a few people to our protest, and I do remember thinking why is everyone else okay with this? Or do you not understand that our government is doing something that is causing people to die? Do you not understand what death is? Is it hard to grasp? I mean, I actually do. As I said, the line between emotion and rationality is sometimes difficult to draw, because sometimes you go your emotion comes from the fact that you're well, I see that 2 + 2 = 4. And that, if it equals 4, you should be upset. And so I am upset because I think it is rational to be upset. And I don't understand why you haven't rationally reached the conclusion that you ought to emotionally be angry.
Yeah, and they can amplify one another, right? Your reasoning capability can lead you to amplify and reinforce and sit with a strong emotion. I mean, one of the interesting things about the Iraq War is I think the anti-war effort, in my view, was a pretty effective mobilization. And if you just look at the results now, 20 years later, I mean, universally, everyone understands the Iraq War was a huge mistake.
Yeah,
I mean,
no one, or hardly anyone defends.
Yeah, you hear right-wing
amazing.
people. Who was it I heard recently? It was someone on the right, it might have been Vivek Ramaswamy, saying that the Iraq War was the worst foreign policy mistake in American history. Yeah. And this is a right-winger saying this.
Yeah.
And the weird thing is, the Iraq War did feel like very much, in many ways, a philosophical debate, because we didn't have TikTok and YouTube and Twitter back then. There were not the images that you see from Gaza today.
That's right.
And yet still, just based on a philosophical objection to the use of force against this foreign country, there were millions of people on the streets, because I was at some of those rallies too in the mid 2000s, and that was part of the reason Obama won in 2008, kind of the backlash against the Iraq War. Yet today we're seeing so much vivid footage of the violence in Gaza, the violence in factory farms, yet so much less mobilization against these systems of violence. And it's hard for me to understand and explain. And I think it actually would be worth digging into. Yeah, I mean, would you agree with that? Do you think?
No, I do agree with that. One of the reasons I agree with it is you made me think of the fact that when we were doing. So I just put out this book with Noam Chomsky, The Myth of American Idealism, which is a book about U.S. foreign policy. And when we were looking for the cover,
which I'm really I haven't read yet, but I'm super excited to read, because you and Noam are both brilliant, and I can't wait to read it. But when we were looking for the cover, I was going back through the Associated Press, all of their pictures of the Iraq War, because I wanted some pictures of the scale of the destruction, and I found it was incredibly difficult to find pictures.
Wow. And then we actually have a chapter on the media, and we talk about, we could quote, I think a CNN or MSNBC correspondent going nobody saw the Iraq War, saying basically you didn't see what we saw out there, because we broadcast sanitized pictures of just a missile being fired. And sure enough, when you go into the photo archive to try, I mean, you could find some stuff, but we didn't see destruction. So you're right that it does kind of show you that for all that we talk about, now with the war in Gaza, the suffering is really up in people's faces. It's hard to deny, there it is. It doesn't seem as if there is a clear correlation between the level of mobilization and popular outrage and the ability to access first-person testimonies and images.
Yeah. So one theory, and this is something that animal rights activists have been debating, is that in some sense, if you have too much footage, it almost immunizes people to the emotional effect of the footage, right? So there's someone named Timothy Potrat who's at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst who's called it the politics of sight. But he describes like the pornography of suffering, that when you see too much suffering, it starts to lose impact on you. And there were a few images and photos and videos of suffering, and they actually became quite famous, like Chelsea Manning's video of the helicopter. I don't know if you've seen the footage. It's awful footage. And it's interesting, though. It's not that gruesome. It's just kind of disturbing.
That's the thing. It's like
this weird
far away,
kind
it's
of
grainy.
black and white, exactly, through some sort of viewfinder on a helicopter. But Chelsea Manning is obviously the famous whistleblower. I mean, one of the reasons we didn't see a lot of the violence from the Iraq War is because the U.S. government prosecuted people, like Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange when they released photo and video of what happened to Iraqi civilians. But we've done some very interesting studies. So I've done all these trials where we're trying to litigate the case for the right to rescue in front of juries, including in very conservative counties. And here's one interesting finding that. Because what we did was we used SurveyMonkey, which I feel bad about, because I think you've even written about how awful SurveyMonkey Mechanical Turk are.
I didn't know SurveyMonkey
Have you written about
was bad,
this?
so maybe we should write about
I know The Intercept has. I thought you had written about how awful these kind of... So Mechanical Turk and SurveyMonkey are these like terrible services where people just sit and click on things. They just take surveys all day, and it's like the worst job, and people aren't paid well. And I feel a little bad about using it, but we needed to get data, and my freedom is at stake, and my friend's freedom is at stake, and we're trying to figure out what is the best way to litigate the case against animal abuse and justify the right to rescue animals from these factory farms. And one really interesting finding was when we showed people the most gruesome footage, we actually got worse results. Like people are more likely to convict us when they just saw animals being tortured. Weird. While when we showed animals in more positive, so when we showed images and photos and video of like a piglet who was cute after a rescue, then they voted to quit us. But when we showed them being tortured and abused, they voted to convict us. Wow. And that was just that kind of blew my mind, because we fought so hard in court to try and get the cruelty evidence into court.
And we don't need this. We just need a picture of a cute piglet.
We need to show the pigs as persons. And I wonder if there's something to be said about that in the context of like anti-war, other types of activism, like the healthcare stuff. Maybe we need to focus more on like the positive outcomes of what happens when we're able to change the system so that people are actually given healthcare, as opposed to these terrible stories of people being denied benefits and dying. I mean, not that stuff matters, because like the positive stories are only positive unless when you understand the context of how shitty the situation is for people before they're given some help. But I do think there's an argument that the left focuses way too much on gloom and doom and not enough on like that positive vision. Because when you think about the civil rights movement, that was a huge part of King's activism too, that he focused on a dream. He didn't focus on the nightmare. He focused on the dream in a lot of his rhetoric. I mean, so I don't know.
No, that's right. I mean, well, basically, if you can't envision something better, why would you join a movement? Right? You're going to join a movement to not accomplish anything. Like, you have to understand that there is something that we are trying to do. We believe it can happen. We believe it's real. Yeah. And so, the vision is a crucial part of it. And with animal rights and animal welfare, if you just the more you understand the scale of the problem, the more you really get a sense of how bad it is. It is almost like, the less you're interested in getting involved, because it feels like, okay, well, what am I doing if I'm stepping into thinking about this? I am tormenting myself with the knowledge of this horrible suffering and pain. And I am also seeing a system that is so vast, so integrated into ordinary life for everyone, that to alter it in any way seems totally impossible and unthinkable. And so, yeah, why would they? If that's what they understand of it, then obviously it's very hard to get involved, to sign up for that, essentially.
Yep.
Whereas if you show them a path, if you say, no, we can actually say, look here, look at this piglet. This piglet is happy today. We made this piglet happy. Look at it, right? That is a very small but very, very real thing where people go, oh my God, like if I step into your space, if I start thinking as you do, like I can do things that are going to feel very gratifying, like I am improving the world through my presence in it. So I think if you're going to accomplish anything, you have to touch that part of people, the part of them that wants to be part of something that does something.
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe this is a good segue into the original reason I asked it on the podcast, which is you talked about how so many people don't want to think about animal cruelty and animal suffering because it feels so hopeless. You do think about it, and I, from what I could tell, and from what you've written on at Current Affairs and other places, you include in your philosophy of socialism. So but I don't know if anyone's ever asked you just how do animals fit into socialism?
Well, I told you earlier about the kind of principle that I see as being at the core of socialism, which is that you look at a society where some people are at the top and living great lives and other people are at the bottom and living worse ones. And basically, it's the expansion of that, right? I think of the old medieval pictures of the kind of great chain of being where it was the people at the top and the animals at the bottom, right? If you're concerned about hierarchies where some people benefit and some people suffer, and if you're concerned about exploitation, and you're concerned that about an equal distribution of the right to have a happy life, right? If these are your kind of starting principles, like looking at the world and saying, where are there unjust hierarchies? Where is there exploitation? And then you start to think about into the relations between species, right? When you start to think about the relationship of human beings to the rest of the world, just applying the basic principle that leads you to kind of socialist conclusions looking at human society, I think kind of has to, if you acknowledge the reality of animal sentience, right? If you believe that they are beings with an inner life that they feel and they think, which I think is pretty undeniable, I think that conclusion is compelled. And that's why, almost all of the most kind of the moral thinkers who are most committed to rationality all come to the conclusion that like animal rights is important. Right? This is why like the effective altruists and the utilitarians like all come to pro-animal rights conclusions, because if you start to think morally seriously, and I think socialism comes from thinking morally seriously about society, if you start to do that and you don't confine your vision, but you actually look at the sum total of all relations between sentient beings, I think you have to come to some belief that animal rights is an important part of your program.
Yeah. So why do you think it is that so few socialists seem to include animals in the conception of hierarchy and unjust power? I mean, let's even use Bernie as an example, because
I use
Bernie a lot.
I'll use Chomsky because I love Chomsky. I think he's one of the most humane and moral people that I've
incredible human being
ever encountered. However, there's a video of him being asked like some basic questions about animal rights because he was not a vegetarian or vegan, and he gives like very thoughtless responses, like the kind of responses that are not satisfying. And I was like,
wait, people usually give to him.
You're this great thinker. Like, what are you?
Yeah.
And I was trying to puzzle over that, and it's like, I mean, some people just have not thought about, nothing has provoked them to think about it, which is understandable. Like, you're in the world, nothing is making you think about it, and you were preoccupied with all of these human concerns, all of these endless issues of pressing human problems. We've touched on some of them, from climate change to healthcare in this conversation. And you can have long conversations about injustice, and animals will be at the bottom of your list. They can't speak for themselves. They can't talk to you. They're locked away in places that are deliberately kept out of view. So if you don't want to think about it and your time is spent on other things, nothing is going to pressure you to think about it.
Yeah. And do you think that's it? That's just the explanation for why people like Chomsky and Bernie have not...
I don't know.
even seemingly address the issue.
Well,
because we put a lot of pressure on Bernie in particular.
Why people don't want to think about this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, so the general public, I think a lot of it comes from just normalization. I mean, people, we're social animals. Most people are too busy trying to keep food on the table, trying to make sure their healthcare expenses don't lead them into financial catastrophe, to spend an enormous amount of time on this. And I think you're right that people who do have the time and the privilege to think about this universally conclude that animal rights is not just a problem, it's a crisis, you know? I think it's a supermajority of moral philosophers will say that eating at least some animals is wrong. You know, I think there's some debate about fish and maybe even chickens, but at least no one argues that there's a moral distinction between a pig and a dog who's serious. There just is not. There's not even semblance of a compelling moral argument. But among the intelligentsia, I mean, my sense is that people like Bernie or Noam Chomsky or frankly, even Ezra Klein, who does think about it and has concluded that veganism is a serious issue and animal rights is a serious issue. I think a lot of it comes from the fact that they just don't feel like there's much to be done about it, right?
That's what I was talking about earlier.
It really relates to what you were saying earlier.
Yeah.
Like, I think maybe this is a concern, but it's kind of like cancer, you know, like cancer exists, it's out there. There's a lot of people suffer from it. Sucks, you know, I hope someone figures it out, but I can't do anything about that. That's just like a natural condition. And cancer is actually an interesting analogy because cancer is also a situation where when you dive deeper into it, you realize there actually are things we can do about it. Now, granted, the solutions to cancer don't relate to power imbalances, or maybe they do. Maybe they do relate to power imbalances in healthcare and in food and so on. But it's not as obvious as, for me, on the problem of animal rights. I think there is like this hierarchy that very clearly exists between human and non-human animals. It is the root cause of so much violence, not just against animals in the food system, but in the wild too. I mean, the way we basically terraform the entire planet to destroy. I don't know if you've seen these biomass charts. Science Magazine just published this terrifying biomass chart. Biomass is just like the weight of all the biological organisms on the planet Earth. Yeah. So basically, over the last 100 years, we've replaced all the biomass, the vertebrate biomass of terrestrial ecosystems, with farm animals, like to the point that, all the wild mammals and birds have disappeared from the planet Earth, and they've been replaced by birds in cages, basically. It's like terrifying. When you look at the chart, it's like 100 years ago, it's like, okay, you got wild animals and you got domesticated animals, including human beings. And now it's like wild animals are this tiny dot in terms of biomass, and the domesticated farm animals, in particular chickens, like, chickens, there's so many chickens, and we're eating so much chicken because it's such a cheap form of protein, and we kill so many of them, and they grow so fast. They grow so fast and they get so big that we can produce them. It's like some weird artificial intelligence that's gotten out of control and is just harvesting these animals as part of their engine. But I think a lot of it for people like, for Bernie, for Noam Chomsky is, and this is why it's like interesting that you have taken a different perspective than a lot of these other thinkers. And maybe it comes from the fact that you believe there's something that can be done about it. And so it's not just this inherent evil of the universe that it's unfortunate, but what are we going to do about it? But you actually have theories as to how we can actually change things, which is awesome. Does that ring true to you? Do you think that's part of the reason someone like Bernie or Noam Chomsky?
Yeah, no, I one of the things about what you say about the transformation of the biomass, and now it's all animals in cages instead of wild animals, is that my conclusion from that is, okay, this is a human-made system. This can be done. If anything that is done can be undone, right? 100 years is a very, very short time. So a lot depends on whether you consider that a long time or a short time. I consider that a short time in the span of the history of animals on Earth. In fact, I consider that the tiniest blip. So you think, okay, well, something has gone very, very wrong in a short amount of time. Well, now we have to think seriously about how to reverse that. I've always been, I think this is one thing that kind of distinguishes me from some others. I've always been kind of a utopian or a positive person, or I've always been very cheerful and forward-looking, and I like to think about where can we go, and to dream of the stars and dream of the great human future. I've written a couple of silly books that are just like utopian novels that are just like looking at the far future, and of course, and it is a world, and I envisioned a world where we treat animals well. So you do have to be able to have that vision. That's one key part of it. Another key part of it, you mentioned the normalization. Now, you recently wrote a great article for us, for Current Affairs, your first for Current Affairs, and we're excited for the next one you're doing. That was about the coming of a new animal rights movement, and you talk about how to undo the normalization there. And so one component of that, obviously, is giving people the vision. One component of it is, you mentioned something that was so cool and striking to me when I read it in your article, which is the cascading effect of like, it's like when one person calls something out, and this came from the Milgram experiments show this too. Like the moment one person says, wait a second, that's an injustice, you like break this sort of thin tissue that is holding together people's the failure to confront something that's really obvious. And then one person points out the emperor has no clothes, and then everyone goes, yeah, you're right, you're totally right. So we would hope that if you combine that kind of forward looking, like something can be done, with also like breaking through that consensus, that normalization, which might be, as your article argues, easier than we think, that leaves you in a place where this issue that seems so hopeless when you first read about it actually seems like, wait a second, this might change really rapidly if we go about this right.
Yeah. The two figures that have influenced me most on this are one of my former mentors, Cass Sunstein, who's written about social cascades and preference cascades, where these things can happen very quickly. But there's another scholar who's a sociologist, and one of the few sociologists that economists cite a lot, because I was doing a PhD in economics and failed miserably and dropped out. Like you, I didn't finish my PhD. But Mark Granovatter is this sociologist at, you know about his work?
Yeah, I remember him. I studied
his work's great.
ties.
It's super cool. So he's most famous for this paper called The Power of Weak Ties that, all the professionals, every time you go to some networking event, they talk about this. Or at least, I don't know, in Silicon Valley, people are always talking about, you got to have a big network, and Mark Granovatter's research shows why. Because that paper is about how oftentimes it's your weak social ties that are more important than your strong social ties, because your strong social ties basically have the same connections and information you have. Because your strong ties tend to be people who are very similar to you, while your weak ties are people who are very different from you. And it turns out professionally, there's a lot of advantage to having lots of weak ties. But he has another paper that was way more influential to me that is about the model of a riot, and it invented the concept of a threshold model in sociology. And the idea behind a threshold model is there are certain systems that seem quite stable, but there's some threshold that needs to pass. And once that threshold is passed, the entire system just can rapidly change very quickly. And sometimes it's as small as one person changing their mind. I mean, depending on how you set up the model. So like, imagine a society where there are 100 people who are thinking about whether to riot, right? And all 100 people need at least one person to riot, right? In order to riot themselves. So that society might look very stable because all 100 people, they all just need one person to riot, and then they're willing to riot too. So like, this might be Iran today. Like Iran, I have some friends who are Iranian, and it seems like a lot of people are very upset about the regime. They don't like it, but they're all kind of scared, and they're like, I don't want to be first. In that sort of system, you can have one person who their personal preferences change to, I don't need one person to riot. I need zero. I'm just going to do it anyways. And that one person riots, and then everybody riots, right? And so one person's changed perspective. And Mark Granovatter said, this sort of system exists all over the place in sociology. And this is why, whether it's fashion trends, movie trends, music, you can see lots of weird changes, because a lot of what human beings do is grounded in these threshold models that can create weird cascades. And I think that's why, I mean, in social movements, like I'm probably going to write a newsletter about this, or maybe even I'll write something for you guys about this. But one of the really interesting things about social movements over the last couple of years, I don't know if you agree with this, but most of them have changed with shocking rapidity. It's not the case that like for gay marriage or for civil rights, there's like steady progress over 200 years.
That's right.
There's this weird inflection point that's reached, and then everything really quickly changes. It's not that we become utopia, but there's massive change very quickly, and then everything stalls again. It happens to like
Jim Crow crumbled really, really quickly.
Very quickly.
Shocking. Adolph Reed has a great book about growing up here in New Orleans under the Jim Crow era, and like how the back of the system was broken and then the whole thing fell apart. Like immediately after like a century of pure white supremacist rule, like within a couple of years, the thing falls apart entirely. So yeah, there can be shockingly rapid victories.
Okay, to end this conversation, let's go back to that first question I asked you. How do you respond to a system that is causing so much suffering, to a system that has these people you hate running the system? And we've had a conversation for an hour. You've been thinking for 2 decades about this. I think there are a lot of people losing trust in the institutions around them, whether it's respect to food, healthcare, economics. What is like the most important advice you give people when they're trying to struggle with their own sense of rage about the system?
Well, now I would say don't just go out and shoot someone who seems like a convenient representative of the system, because that's probably not optimal. The first thing is, the first step is to find a way to reconcile what we've talked about, which is the mixture of your anger with your understanding that you have to think strategically and pragmatically about. You've got to look at the world and try and understand how it works. And you've got to understand, you should study the history of social movements that successfully accomplish things. And you got to figure out, what is the path? This guy who was this shooter clearly didn't do much thinking about what is the path, right? If I am upset by this thing, what is the change that I envision, and how can we possibly get there? And so then you start doing the kinds of things that you and I are thinking about, the kinds of things that you and I have been talking about here, which is, okay, well, what causes people's preferences to change? What causes people's values to change? What causes them to take action? And we have historical models of this. And then you say, well, okay, well, how do I, in the position that I'm in, how do I plug into this? And, for me personally, I found that I plugged into it by, okay, well, I'm a good writer. So what's my power? Well, my power is making arguments that people listen to. My power is that, so I started a magazine, right? And my power is getting information and arguments out there. And so I could write a book called Why You Should Be a Socialist, which I did. Or I could help Noam Chomsky write a book explaining U.S. foreign policy. So, that's where I feel like I fit in best, but everyone fits in different places. And so, then you have to find, where can you as a person plug into the world in a way that you're going to make some small contribution to pushing it in the direction you want it to go.
That's wonderful. I think that's very, very sound advice. So thanks for chatting, Nathan. Maybe can you just end by saying where can people follow your work and get your most recent book?
Sure. People should go to currentaffairs.org and they should check out our online magazine, and then they should go to currentaffairs.org/subscribe to get our beautiful print edition. We have a podcast at patreon.com/currentaffairs, and I am at Nathan J. Robinson on X/Twitter. As I mentioned, I've got a new book out, which is The Myth of American Idealism with Chomsky. So yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Wayne. Love to talk to you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Until next time. We don't have to hurt animals. You can protect them. We don't have to kill them. We can care for them. And that's who we're meant to be, right? That's who we are when we're at our best. We're caring for each other and for the other living beings of this earth and not hurting them.